They said he was the largest man ever born on the plantation. Shoulders like tree trunks, hands that could lift a mule cart clear off the ground, and eyes that rarely blinked for long. When he walked, the dirt seemed to move away from his feet. When he stopped, even the air forgot what to do. He never spoke, not a word, not a sound. Those who tried to greet him learned quickly that silence was all they would ever get. Some called him Jonah. Others said he had no name, that it was taken from him before he learned how to use it. He belonged to no one, and yet, somehow, everyone feared him. He wasn't violent. He wasn't wild. He worked. From sunup to sundown, his strength fed the land that fed the master. And when the day was done, he would sit under the same old oak by the quarters, staring into the field as if waiting for something that never came. The children would gather at a distance, whispering stories about him. They said he carried the silence of the dead, that every time someone cried out under the whip, he took their sound and buried it inside himself. The overseers called it obedience. The others called it survival. But those who had seen true pain knew what it really was. His silence was not peace. It was a grave that he carried in his chest. Every man, every woman, every child who ever disappeared from that land was buried somewhere behind those eyes. No one knew where he came from. Some said Georgia. Others said he was brought straight from the coast, chained and half dead, sold for more than any man the master had ever bought. But what made him different wasn't his size. It was that silence, thick, endless, and alive. When he passed, even the birds went quiet. When he looked at you, it felt like he was measuring your soul, weighing whether you were one of the guilty or one of the gone. Years passed. The seasons changed. Men aged and died, but Jonah remained, strong as the first day he was brought there. The master grew old, his sons crueler than him, but Jonah never raised a hand, never raised a voice. Only worked. Only watched. And behind that quiet face, something waited, patient as wrought under wood, steady as a storm that hasn't yet reached the land. They said silence keeps the truth safe. But what no one tells you is that truth doesn't stay buried forever. One day, when the time was right, even the quietest man will speak. And when Jonah finally did, when that deep voice broke the weight of decades, the world of that plantation would never sound the same again. Alabama, 1847. The land stretched wide and red, the soil thick with memory. Rows of cotton rolled toward the horizon like waves that never stopped. The Callaway plantation stood in the center of it all, a kingdom built from pain and polished with pride. Every plank of its mansion, every stone in its yard, carried the weight of someone who hadn't lived long enough to see it finished. It was beautiful from a distance, cruel when you got close. Master Callaway ruled it like a god who needed no heaven. His face was always clean, his boots always shining, his words sharper than the tools the field hands used. He was a man who believed that control was proof of life, and that power was something you fed daily, like an animal. His voice carried across the fields at dawn, his shadow stretched farther than it should have, and his anger, when it came, was quick and without reason. He bought men the way others bought wine, with ceremony and satisfaction. But the day he bought the giant, even he hesitated. Jonah arrived in a wagon so large it groaned with each turn of the wheel. His wrists were bound in iron too thick for most men to carry. When they pulled him off the cart, the air shifted. He stood taller than any man on that land had ever seen, his back broad enough to cast the others in shade. The slaves stopped their work. The overseers stopped pretending not to be afraid. Callaway smiled that thin, deliberate smile he used when he thought God was watching. "Worth every coin," he said. To him, Jonah was an investment, a trophy of strength, a beast who could move mountains for him if told to. He ordered the irons to stay. Said he liked the way they looked against Jonah's skin. The overseers gave him a name because they needed one. Jonah. They said it fit, because like the man in Scripture, he was swallowed whole, not by a fish, but by the world itself. And though the name was never his, he accepted it in silence, as he did everything else. He didn't speak. He didn't fight. He just worked, and watched. From the first morning, he carried more than anyone else. He hauled trees that 10 men together couldn't lift. He plowed through mud deeper than his knees, never pausing, never asking. The others whispered that he didn't feel pain, but the truth was worse, he simply didn't answer to it. Every command, every lash, every insult fell against him like rain against stone. Calloway often watched him from the porch, drink in hand, eyes full of pride and something colder. He liked to show Jonah off to visitors, making him stand nearby as proof of his wealth and power. To the master, Jonah wasn't a man. He was a monument. But to those who lived and labored beside him, he was something else, a mystery too large to speak of, a reminder that silence sometimes carries more danger than any scream ever could. Master Calloway's hunger for power was not fed by land or labor alone. He needed to be seen. His pride required eyes upon him, and so he filled his house with guests, planters, traders, men who carried the same kind of cruelty in their smiles. When they gathered on the veranda, sipping and boasting of yields and prices, Calloway would summon Jonah as if he were part of the show. He would have him stand in the yard, shirtless beneath the sun, his skin glistening with the day's sweat. "Look there," Calloway would say, voice dripping with satisfaction. "Even the largest man on earth bends to me." His guests would laugh, nodding in agreement, some with fear, others with envy. They'd test Jonah's strength, make him lift wagons, pull posts from the ground, hold barrels overhead. He obeyed every command with the same still face, eyes never rising to meet theirs. The men called him a beast, a wonder, a freak of God's making. The women, watching from shaded windows, saw something else, the quiet dignity that no amount of command could erase. And among the slaves, Jonah became something deeper. To the men, he was a shield, to the women, a silent prayer. He never spoke, but his presence alone told them to endure. But while the master's pride grew, so too did the whispers. The fields had begun to fill with boys, 9 of them, each strong in the shoulders, each with a sharpness in their gaze that made the elders uneasy. They were all born on the same land, within a few short years of one another, and though they worked in different corners of the fields, there was something in their faces that tied them together. Ezekiel, the eldest, carried himself like a man though he was barely grown. The others followed his lead, sensing the same blood running through them though no one dared say whose it was. Their mothers never spoke of it. Some had died giving birth, others had been sold away before their sons could walk. What remained were boys bound by resemblance, not of skin alone, but of the eyes, the jaw, the same quiet fire that burned beneath the surface. At night, the old women in the quarters whispered of the truth. They said these boys did not share a mother, but a father, one who wore fine clothes and rode a white horse. They said Master Calloway had built more than a plantation. He had built a legacy of shame, walking freely while the proof of his crimes grew up in his own fields. Jonah knew. He didn't need words or gossip. He saw it in the faces of those boys every day, saw the shadow of their father hanging over them. And when Calloway laughed before his guests, boasting of his power, Jonah's silence deepened. For he alone knew that the master's greatest display was not his wealth, nor his giant slave, but the 9 boys who bore his face and didn't yet know what that meant. The 9 boys grew like roots through the soil, each one finding his place in the hard rhythm of the fields. Ezekiel, the eldest, worked beside Jonah most days. He was tall for his age, his shoulders already carrying a man's burden, and though his back bent under the same weight as the others, his eyes carried something different, a question he hadn't learned how to ask. The younger boys watched him, followed him, trusted his silence almost as much as they trusted Jonah's. The second boy, Samuel, had quick hands and a sharper mind. He could tie knots that never came loose, climb trees the overseers thought no one could reach. Then came Isaiah, strong but gentle, always looking after the smallest ones. The youngest, Levi, was only 6, small enough to still run barefoot through the grass, old enough to know what pain looked like even when no one spoke of it. Each boy bore a piece of the others. The same jawline. The same eyes. The same shadow they didn't yet understand. They lived in the same quarters, ate the same scraps, shared the same silence. Jonah was never far. When the overseers raised their voices, he appeared from nowhere, his towering frame enough to quiet the threats. He never touched the whip, never spoke a word, but his presence alone was enough to make cruelty hesitate. The boys didn't need him to talk, they understood him through the way he stood, through the steadiness of his breath when theirs faltered. In the evenings, after the fields had gone still, Jonah would sit near the fire and carve small shapes from wood. The boys gathered around him, whispering to one another while he worked. Birds, horses, figures of men with outstretched arms. He would hand one to each of them, no explanation given, no words exchanged. It became their ritual, their lesson without language. When the overseers beat the older ones for working too slow, Jonah stood at the edge of the field, unmoving. His eyes burned like coals, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. The boys learned from that silence, not to bow, not to cry, not to forget. His silence became their strength. His stillness, their shield. Ezekiel once told the younger ones, "He don't need to talk to us. He already told us what to do." They believed it, because in Jonah's quiet, they found something truer than words, endurance that could not be taught, only shown. They worked, they bled, they grew. 9 boys shaped by the same land, bound by the same secret they did not yet know. 9 reflections of a man who called himself their master. 9 mirrors of one man's sin. The older slaves carried memories like scars that never healed. When they spoke of the master, their voices dropped to whispers, the kind that trembled with what they dared not say too loud. They remembered the nights when Calloway's footsteps left the big house after dark, moving quiet as a fox toward the quarters. The dogs never barked. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Those who lived long enough to tell it said those visits were when the world turned upside down, when power slipped its mask and showed its true face. Women vanished during those nights. Some were sent away without warning. Others reappeared months later, eyes hollow, bodies weaker, carrying children who looked nothing like them. The master called it nature. The overseers called it fate. But the women knew. They prayed in silence, holding their newborns close as if trying to shield them from the blood that made them. The children's faces told the story no one dared to repeat. Jonah saw it all. He was made to. One night, when the master's shadow stretched toward the women's quarters, Jonah stepped in his path. He didn't raise a hand, didn't speak a word, only stood there, blocking the way. The overseers came fast, and for the first time, they chained him not for what he did, but for what he refused to let happen. They dragged him behind the cabins, bound his wrists to a post where every soul on the land could see him. They left him there through the night. The master went on with his visit. The screams were heard, and then they stopped, swallowed by the dark. When dawn came, Jonah was still standing, body torn but head unbowed. The others waited for him to speak, to curse, to cry out, but he did not. His lips pressed shut, blood at the corners of his mouth, eyes locked somewhere beyond what anyone else could see. From that morning on, his voice was gone. He did not lose it, he buried it. Whatever he had heard, whatever he had seen that night, became a weight too heavy for sound. The others said he gave his words to the dead, that his silence became the wall between what was done and what could never be undone. Some silences are not born from fear, but from what they know. And Jonah knew more than any man should ever have to carry. The winter came early that year, harder than anyone remembered. Frost crept across the fields before the harvest was done, turning the earth stiff and gray. The cold made the air sharp enough to cut the lungs, and the slaves worked through it with hands cracked and bleeding. The Callaway plantation, once loud with command and movement, grew quiet except for the sound of wind scraping through the trees. But silence on that land was never peace, it was warning. Master Calloway grew meaner with the cold. His temper, once measured, now turned sudden and wild. He found reasons to punish, to remind every man, woman, and child that he still ruled the living. He began sending the 9 boys to different parts of the estate, claiming it was to spread the strength. But everyone knew better. The fields, the stables, the mills, he scattered them so they would not stand together. Unity frightened him more than rebellion. Ezekiel was sent to the far field, miles from where Jonah worked. The younger ones were divided between chores, barely glimpsing one another except at nightfall. The laughter that once lived between them vanished, replaced by long, empty looks. The old women prayed under their breath, knowing what separation meant. Jonah felt it before anyone else, the quiet breaking of something he had guarded for years. His hands, once steady as stone, began to tremble. He no longer ate, no longer rested. The nights found him pacing the quarters, eyes locked on the big house across the field, watching the lights move behind the curtains. Each flicker told him something he didn't want to know. He worked harder by day, harder than ever before, as though the weight in his chest could be beaten back with labor. But it didn't fade. The others noticed. His silence, once calm, now pressed on everyone like a storm held too long. The overseer muttered to another, "That giant's silence feels heavier than thunder." They laughed after saying it, but their laughter died quick. They could feel it too, the pressure in the air, the change in the wind, the promise of something waiting to happen. Jonah's eyes followed the master wherever he went. Every gesture, every cruel smile, every visit to the barns after dusk. He didn't speak it, couldn't speak it, but inside him the truth was shifting, restless, alive. Something was coming. He knew it the way the land knows rain before it falls. When the frost began to thaw and the mud returned to the fields, the master's greed rose again with the heat. The harvest had been lean, and Calloway blamed it on mouths that ate too much and hands that worked too slow. He told the overseers that some of the young ones would be sold before spring, said it as if he were pruning trees. The words fell easy from his lips, but everyone who heard them felt the chill return to their bones. A week later, he sent for Jonah. The order was simple: bring the oldest boys to the barn before dawn. Prepare them. No one asked what that meant. No one needed to. The barn was where things changed shape, where horses were broken, where bodies learned the cost of defiance, and where silence became the law of the land. Jonah walked there before the sun rose, his shadow long across the frozen ground. Inside the barn hung ropes and chains, the tools of a master who believed himself righteous. The smell of iron and earth filled the air. As Jonah waited, the memories began to come, faces of women who had vanished, cries that once pierced the dark, the soft voices of the children those nights had left behind. One by one, the images returned until he could no longer separate the living from the ghosts. When the boys arrived, he saw it clearly for the first time. Their faces, their eyes, the line of their mouths, all of them carried the same mark. The resemblance was too perfect, too cruel. They weren't slaves to be sold. They were the master's own blood, born of the women he had taken by force and discarded like tools once used. In that barn, among the ropes and the iron, Jonah understood the master's plan. The sale was no business deal, it was a burial. Calloway wasn't selling labor. He was erasing proof. Erasing his shame from the world before it could grow old enough to bear his name. Jonah had always known. He had seen the truth in pieces, in the faces, the gestures, the silence of the women who'd gone missing. But now, standing before the boys, he saw it whole. The master had filled his land with his own sin, and now he meant to cleanse it with the auction block. For years Jonah's silence had been his weapon, his way of keeping peace where none existed. But in that moment, it turned into a wound. It pressed against him from the inside, aching to break. The truth he had buried began to stir, whispering against the walls of his chest, demanding to be heard. He could no longer pretend it was just the master's sin. It was his too, because he had watched, and waited, and kept silent while evil grew in the light of day. And though no sound left his mouth yet, something inside him shifted. The quiet that had once been his shield began to crack. That night, the land went quiet in a way it never had before. The wind stopped its restless moving, the trees stood like witnesses, and the fire in the quarters burned low and still. The others had gone to their shacks, worn from the day, but Jonah stayed by the embers, motionless, staring into the red glow as if it were showing him the shape of something he had long refused to see. Ezekiel found him there, the eldest boy, his face half-shadowed, his hands rough from work that belonged to grown men. He sat beside Jonah without speaking. They had done this many nights before, sharing a silence that neither feared nor questioned. But tonight, the air between them was heavy, thick with something alive and waiting. Jonah's breath was slow, uneven, his eyes fixed on the flames. Then, without warning, he turned to the boy. The movement was so sudden it made Ezekiel's heart jump. For the first time in decades, Jonah's lips began to move. His voice came out raw, and used, barely more than air. A whisper, soft but jagged, shaped from words that had been buried too long. Ezekiel leaned closer, thinking he had misheard, but when the words reached him, his face changed. His eyes widened first, then his jaw clenched, then his whole body stiffened as if the ground itself had betrayed him. The whisper was short, a single sentence, but it tore through everything he thought he knew. His breath caught, his mouth opened, but no sound came. He stumbled back from the fire, shaking his head, whispering, "No, no," as if the word itself could undo what he'd just learned. Jonah didn't move. He didn't call out. He only looked at the boy, the same way he had looked at the world for so many years, with eyes too full to hold more pain. Ezekiel turned and ran, his footsteps fading into the darkness, the sound of his breathing swallowed by the cold night air. It wasn't a scream that broke the night. It was a whisper. And it carried the weight of every sin the soil could hold. Ezekiel's footsteps carried him across the fields like thunder waiting for lightning. The night had no moon, only clouds pressing low, heavy with rain. The boy didn't feel the cold or the mud beneath his feet. The whisper still echoed in his mind, clawing at his chest with every breath. By the time he reached the big house, the lamps inside were still burning, and through the windows, he saw the master, calm, seated, unaware that his world was about to split open. Ezekiel didn't knock. He burst through the door, his voice breaking the years of silence that had ruled that land. The words came out raw, furious, naming what no one had dared to speak. The master rose slowly, eyes narrowing, the cruel calm of a man who believed himself untouchable. But Ezekiel kept shouting, each word cutting deeper, spilling the truth Jonah had carried for too long. The sound of it drew others from the quarters. Shadows gathered at the edge of the yard, watching, listening. Then came the first gunshot. A flash from the porch, the echo rolling across the fields. The slaves woke to chaos, shouting, screams, the clatter of hooves as overseers rushed from their shacks. The rain began to fall in thin, silver lines, and the sky cracked open with sound. Amid it all, Jonah appeared, stepping out from the darkness, no chains around his wrists, no hesitation in his stride. His silence was no longer surrender, it was the calm before judgment. He moved toward the house as flames began to lick the curtains from within. The master shouted orders, but his voice wavered. The overseers aimed their guns, yet their hands trembled. Jonah's figure filled the doorway, his shadow rising across the walls like something ancient. They said he caught a bullet in his shoulder and didn't flinch. They said the master tried to run. Before the blaze swallowed the house, some swore they saw Jonah lift Calloway with one hand, holding him there in the flickering light, master and man, bound by the same secret that had poisoned them both. And then, the roof gave way. Fire and rain met in a hiss that could be heard across the fields. When it cleared, neither man was seen again. The 9 boys scattered through the storm, each running in a different direction, each carrying a piece of the night's truth. The wind howled across the fields, sweeping away tracks, names, and the last remains of the Calloway estate. By dawn, all that was left was smoke, mud, and silence. The kind that follows when something old finally dies. Days passed before the smoke finally lifted. What had once been the Calloway plantation was nothing more than a hollow of ash and twisted timber. The great house that had ruled over so many lives was reduced to a skeleton of blackened beams, its fine porch sunken into the earth. The fields, once measured and perfect, lay scorched, the soil cracked like old skin. The smell of burnt cotton clung to the air, mingling with the sour scent of rain. The overseers who survived told their stories differently. Some swore Jonah had died in the fire, others said they saw him walking through the smoke, untouched by flame. One man claimed he followed the prints left in the wet ground, large as shovels, leading away from the ruins and into the swamp beyond the tree line. At the edge of that path lay a single broken chain, still warm to the touch. After that, the tracks vanished. They searched for days but found nothing, no body, no bones, no proof that the giant had ever existed at all. Yet on nights when the thunder rolled over the valley, those who lived nearby said they could hear it, a low whisper that moved through the trees, carried by the wind, faint but steady, as if the land itself remembered his voice. Some said it was warning. Others said it was confession. The 9 boys were never seen together again. Ezekiel and 2 of the older ones were said to have crossed the river with a group of runaways, heading north toward freedom. Others scattered south, blending into towns where no one asked about their pasts. A few changed their names, taking words from scripture, from dreams, from places they had never seen but hoped to reach. Years later, a man in Georgia spoke of a field hand with eyes too familiar, too knowing. Another in Louisiana described a preacher who never raised his voice but carried a silence that filled a room. Some vanished completely, swallowed by time and distance, their bloodlines threading quietly into the world beyond that cursed land. No one rebuilt the plantation. The Calloway name died with the smoke. What remained was a stretch of forgotten ground and a story the locals still whisper when the storms roll in, about a giant who never spoke, and the night his silence turned to thunder. The years had turned Ezekiel's hands to stone and his hair to frost. He lived far from Alabama now, in a place where winters came gentle and the air did not carry the sound of chains. The war had ended, men had written new laws, and freedom, though spoken, still felt fragile, like something borrowed rather than earned. When the abolitionist men found him, they came not with chains, but with paper and questions. They had heard of the fire, of the giant, of that night when the sky itself seemed to break. Ezekiel sat on a porch that looked toward the woods, his body bent but his eyes still sharp beneath the years. The men asked him about Jonah, the giant who never spoke. They said they were collecting accounts, for the sake of history, so that truth would not vanish as easily as smoke. Ezekiel nodded, slow and heavy, and said there were truths that did not belong to paper. Still, they pressed, their pencils trembling above the page. He spoke of the plantation, of the boys, of how silence ruled more fiercely than any whip. His voice cracked, but he did not stop. When one of them asked what Jonah had whispered that night, Ezekiel's face grew still. The porch creaked beneath his boots as the wind moved through the trees, carrying the smell of rain. He looked past them, past the world that had changed, and into the one that still lived in his memory. For a long moment, he said nothing. His lips moved, but no sound came. Then, just above a whisper, he answered. He said, "Master did to his sons what he did to their mothers." The words hung in the air like smoke that refused to fade. The men froze, their pens still. One of them looked at the other, unsure whether to write it down. The oldest of the group closed his notebook softly, as if afraid of disturbing something sacred or cursed. No one spoke again for the rest of the interview. They rose, nodded, and left him there, sitting alone with the memory that had followed him across a lifetime. As they walked away, one of them glanced back and saw Ezekiel still staring at the woods, the same way Jonah once had, as though listening for a whisper only he could hear. Jonah never spoke again. The world moved on without his footsteps, without the sound of his breath. But what he whispered that night did not die in the fire. It passed through time like wind through the trees, unseen, but always felt. It lived in the sons who carried his silence, in the children who never knew why their fathers looked away when thunder rolled, and in the earth itself, which still held the weight of what it had witnessed. They called him a giant, but it wasn't his body that made him one. It was what he bore, the burden of truth too heavy for words. He had carried it longer than any man should, until the night he let it slip into the world, soft as breath, sharp as a blade. His whisper became a wound that time refused to heal. Generations passed, and the plantation vanished from maps. Grass grew over its ruins, and rain washed the last ashes into the river. Yet, on nights when storms crossed Alabama, some said you could still feel it, that same tremor in the air, that same whisper rising through the thunder. It was as if the land itself remembered what had been done and what had been spoken too late. History remembers those who screamed, those whose cries were loud enough to echo through time. But sometimes, it's the quiet ones who never leave. The whisper that began in fire still moves in silence, carried from one generation to the next, not to frighten, but to remind. That truth, no matter how long it is buried, will one day find its voice. If stories like this move you, subscribe, share, and let their voices be heard. Every whisper deserves to be remembered.